Okay, well, I'm really pleased to be with you this evening to tell you a little bit about my research studying chimpanzees in Uganda. And in order to tell you about the work that I'm doing now, I think I just want to be able to share a little bit of my journey with you first. And I can't talk about the work I do now without talking about my journey at Central Washington University and the role that has played in my research. So I first began to learn about chimpanzees, at first as an apprentice and later as a master's student at the former Chimpanzee and Human Communication Institute. And in my time there, in learning about these amazing chimpanzees, it really made me want to study chimpanzees more and also to really be able to do work that would advocate for their welfare and conservation. So that was a really important place for me. And Central Washington University is really important in that regard as well. And it was also during my time at CWU that I had my first field research experience. And that was through the Biodiversity and Conservation Field School in China, where I got to study Tibetan macaques. And I really got the field work bug being in China and really enjoyed my time there so much that it made me really want to continue to do field work and studying non-human primates in their natural environments. And so after getting my master's degree at CWU, the following year, I was able to go to the field to study chimpanzees for the first time. And I'm just going to pause here for a moment to tell you I don't have my normal internet connection this evening, so I hope I'm not going to freeze up too much, but if I am, just let me know. Okay, so I went as a volunteer field assistant to Uganda, and in my time there, I was helping a PhD student who was doing a study looking at how habitat type affected stress and disease in chimpanzees. And as part of that research, I was assigned to collect data on chimpanzees at a small forest called the Kasokwa Forest. And this is a small riverine patch of forest. It measures just less than one single square kilometer in size. So it's a very small forest patch. But there's a community of about 15 chimpanzees living there at the time. And I'll repeatedly use the term chimpanzee community. That's just a social group of chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are territorial, and so they associate with members of their own social group, but they tend to be aggressive when they encounter members of other communities. So in my time studying at Kasokwa, what I started to really realize and understand better was that Kasokwa chimpanzees weren't the only ones living in this kind of fragmented forest habitat. And you can see Kasokwa indicated with the red star on this map. So this is Western Uganda. There are two large blocks of forests, the Budongo and Bigoma forests in this region. And each of those forests is home to about 600 chimpanzees. And then the area between those forests is this kind of network of fragmented riverine forest habitat. And the small patches of forest are surrounded almost entirely by villages and farmland. And that region measures about 600 square kilometers in size, and it's just made up of this kind of fragmented habitat. And this already fragmented habitat has become increasingly fragmented in recent decades, with about 130 square kilometers or more of forest lost in the past 30 years. But it became increasingly evident, and researchers started to realize that chimpanzees were still able to inhabit this kind of habitat, even though it wasn't sort of a larger, more pristine kind of forest. And almost 20 years ago, researchers used a nest count survey in a small part of this area to estimate the size and the density of this chimpanzee population. And so nest counts are often used in this kind of a situation where you want to be able to roughly estimate the number of individuals present just based on the nest, because chimpanzees build a new nest each night to sleep in typically. And so that looks like what you can see in the lower right, a mother and an infant chimpanzee in a nest. And so based on a nest count survey that was done in a small area, they estimated that the total population size in this region may have been about 70 chimpanzees total. And this is kind of characteristic of a larger pattern in Uganda of habitat loss and fragmentation. Between 1990 and 2010, about 37% of the forest is estimated to have been lost in Uganda. And that's associated with a 3.8% human population growth rate annually, which is one of the highest annual growth rates of any country in the world. So you can imagine that as populations increase, there are increasing pressures on natural resources. And this is also associated with subsistence agriculture, but also with large-scale agriculture, large-scale production of crops like sugarcane and tobacco and other cash crops. And these are often managed by large multinational corporations. And in addition to that, there's this population of about 500 or 5,000 endangered chimpanzees in Uganda, mostly in large protected areas like national parks, but in many unprotected areas as well. And this is also what we see on a broader scale in the Anthropocene. And this is a term that's kind of used broadly to refer to this period in time that we're in, where humans are having a really massive impact on environments worldwide. So it's estimated that 40% of species worldwide are threatened with extinction, and key drivers of these extinction threats are habitat loss and fragmentation. And it's estimated that the majority of forested areas now lie within 1 kilometer of a forest edge. So how do species respond to these kind of changing environments? Specifically, with regard to great apes, our closest living relatives, all of them are either endangered or critically endangered. And they've experienced recent steep declines in the availability of suitable habitat. But the impacts of habitat fragmentation on their behavior are not well understood. So in West Africa, it's estimated that up to 81% of chimpanzees now live outside of protected areas. And human impacts can lead to a number of different effects. One can be a loss of behavioral diversity. So in areas where there's greater human impact on chimpanzee populations, they tend to show lower behavioral diversity, for example, fewer types of tool use behaviors. But it can also induce behavioral flexibility as well. So for example, chimpanzees may feed more on crops in areas of human influence. They may reduce their vocalizations to not be detected by people, or they might change their activity patterns, for example, by foraging at night when they're less likely to be seen by people. So I became really interested in how habitat fragmentation affects chimpanzee populations, and I decided to pursue looking at this as my PhD project. So much of the research I'll tell you about is my research that I did for my PhD, and then some research that I've done more recently as well. So I was interested in how it affects population size and distribution, and how it affects community structure in chimpanzees as well. And what I mean by that is, as I mentioned, chimpanzees are territorial. They will actively defend their area of habitat against other groups of chimpanzees. They also have male philopatry. That means that males remain in the group the community that they're born into throughout their entire lives, and males tend to develop close bonds with each other. And alternatively, females tend to leave the group that they're born into when they reach maturity and move to another group. And this helps to reduce the risk of inbreeding. But in a really fragmented forest habitat, that might be different. So while a normal chimpanzee community might display all of those things, we might see a really different pattern if the habitat is really fragmented. We might see fewer signs of territoriality because chimpanzees can't easily defend the area where they live. We might not really see signs of male philopatry because the chimpanzees really are broken into different areas of fragmented forest, and males don't have such close, tight-knit bonds. And females may not be able to easily disperse as the habitat becomes more fragmented because it becomes harder to find suitable areas, other chimpanzee communities to disperse to, essentially. So I was really interested in how this might work in a population like this one. But how can we study them in this kind of environment? They are pretty elusive, so they try to stay away from people in order to not come into conflict with their human neighbors. And this is a really large area, more than 600 square kilometers of habitat. So we can't simply, observe them behaviorally closely. We can't do what Jane Goodall did and just kind of watch them and take close behavioral data. And that's what we see this researcher doing. This is Jess Hartle. She's another CW alumna. And here she is studying chimpanzees in Kibale National Park in Uganda. And that's exactly how she collects her data, by taking close behavioral observations. But for a project like mine, that didn't really make sense. But luckily, there are some other ways that we can use to study their behavior. So if we just want to understand population size and distribution, we can do something like nest counts, as I mentioned before. We can also use camera trapping. That's another alternative method to just be able to either take photographs or video of chimpanzee behavior remotely. And much of the work that I've been doing in the past several years has been analyzing camera trap videos of chimpanzees. And I won't have time to talk about that this evening, but if anyone's interested in talking about camera trapping, I am happy to talk about that more. We could also do non-invasive sampling for genetic, hormone, and pathogen analysis. And people can even use drones to study behavior or to monitor populations as well. So there's a number of different methods. And so I decided to use non-invasively collected fecal samples for genetic analysis. And without going into too much detail, this is the idea behind that. So I use something called microsatellite genotyping. Microsatellites are short, repetitive sequences of DNA. And these microsatellite loci are randomly distributed throughout the genome. And it's the number of repeats that defines the microsatellite allele. So in the top row, we have 4 repeats of TAG, and in the bottom row, it's 3 repeats of TAG. And so those are 2 different alleles. Microsatellites have high mutation levels, so that means that they have many different alleles, which leads to a lot of individual variation. And it's really useful because then by combining data from different microsatellite loci, we can define an individual's genotype, and that's unique to them. So this is kind of something we could think of as a genetic fingerprint. It can be used to identify individuals, determine the sex of individuals, and also to determine parent-offspring relationships. And this is the same sort of technology that we would use for paternity testing or for crime scenes to identify individuals and those sorts of things. So it's commonly used in human genetics as well as in studying many other animal species as well. And the good thing about it is that it works well even with low quality DNA samples like these non-invasively collected fecal samples. So these were my research goals then based on that. To use a non-invasive genetic approach to estimate the size and the distribution of this population in a human-dominated landscape, to examine patterns of chimpanzee dispersal in a fragmented forest habitat, to explore evidence for chimpanzee behavioral flexibility in this habitat, and finally to explore patterns of male reproductive success in a small chimpanzee community under anthropogenic or human pressure. So just very briefly, I'll tell you a little bit about how we did this. We collected 15 months of data in the field, and this was a broad repeated search effort over more than 600 square kilometers of habitat. And in the end, we collected 865 fecal samples, and we genotyped these at 14 microsatellite loci. And I did this as with the collaboration of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. So we lived there for a number of years doing the analyses for this. And in the end, we identified 182 individual chimpanzees based on the number of unique genotypes. And that was 71 males and 111 females. And so this shows you the distribution of genotyped samples throughout the study area. And you can see that chimpanzees were broadly distributed throughout this entire region. And we collected, on average, 3.5 samples per individual. And we were able to use those data to estimate the total population size, or to do a genetic survey of the population size. And that led to a population size estimate of 319 chimpanzees. And the density of chimpanzees within the forest fragments themselves was 2.13 per square kilometer, which is interesting because it's actually higher than the density that was found at the nearby Budongo forest, which you can see just up here. And then based on the clusters of co-sampled genotypes found in association, I was able to estimate the size and the distribution of different chimpanzee communities in the area. What I mean by that is that we would often collect fecal samples from underneath fresh nests. So the chimpanzees would wake up in the morning from their nests, defecate out of the nest, and we would find these samples underneath the nests. So if I found 3 samples one morning, and those corresponded to individuals A, B, and C, then I know that A, B, and C were all members of the same community, because you would only nest with other individuals if they're members of your own community. Then the next morning, if I found 4 nests and I found individuals B, C, D, and E underneath, samples from them underneath those nests, then we know that A through E are all part of a single community together because of this association of co-sampled genotypes. So that's the idea. Then I was able to estimate the size and the distribution of the population of these different communities, rather, based on that. And this indicated that there were at least 9 different communities throughout this region, with each one having 8 to 48 chimpanzees present in it. So just in summary of that, so we have a minimum population size of 182 chimpanzees based on the number of genotypes we found. The genetic survey suggested over 300 chimpanzees live in the region between Budongo and Bugoma in this fragmented forest habitat. And that's more than 4 times what was estimated previously based on nest count data that were extrapolated across the area. And the density in fragmented forest exceeded that in nearby continuous forest. And there were at least 9 communities present, each with between 8 and 48 chimpanzees. So next, I wanted to understand whether chimpanzees were still able to disperse, particularly whether females could disperse when they reached maturity. So do chimpanzees show evidence of male philopatry and female dispersal despite human disturbance? So my approach was to use genetic parentage analysis to identify parent-offspring relationships and use the community affiliations of those individuals to infer the occurrence of prior dispersal events. Now, this is really wordy, but let me just simplify it. Here's what that really means. If a mother's genotype is found in one community and her daughter's genotype is found in another community, we can infer that the daughter dispersed at some point. We can infer that that daughter reached maturity, left home, and moved to another community because we found her genotype elsewhere. So I compared what I found with father-son pairs to what I found with mother-daughter pairs using this parentage analysis from the genetic data. And here's what I found for the father-son pairs. So each of these black circles represents an individual chimpanzee community, and the colored dots and the lines connecting them indicate a father-son pair. So what we see here is exactly what we would expect if males are philopatric. Fathers and sons are always found associated in the same community together. If we look at the pattern for mother-daughter pairs, though, we see something really different. Mothers and daughters were frequently found in different communities from one another, indicating that the daughters had at some point left home and moved to a new community. And these were statistically different from each other, really showing that there's a true pattern of differentiated male philopatry and female dispersal in this population, despite habitat fragmentation. And we also found evidence that a female dispersed during the study period, where we sampled her at just the southern edge of the Budongo forest in this area, and then we sampled her again several times about 1.5 years later. And this indicated that she had moved communities. She was found in association with members of this new community 1.5 years later. And interestingly, she moved into a more fragmented habitat. And to get there, it was about 13 kilometers of farmland and villages between her former home and her new home. We also found evidence of behavioral flexibility, in particular with regard to nesting and feeding patterns. So the chimpanzees seem to preferentially nest in exotic tree species, in particular eucalyptus. They would nest in eucalyptus disproportionately often. And even if there was a nearby patch of natural forest, they would often nest in the adjacent eucalyptus plantation instead. And we don't know why they like eucalyptus in particular so much, but it may be, we know that eucalyptus has insect repellent properties. You may have used eucalyptus insect repellent before, or a candle with eucalyptus to keep the bugs away. And these insect repellent properties may make it a really nice tree to nest in at night to keep the bugs from biting you during the night. We're not really sure why they like it so much, but they seem to preferentially choose this species that had been introduced as a cultivated tree species. And they were also introducing new kinds of crop foods into their diet as well that they haven't been observed to eat previously, even at other field sites. And this is probably in response to these really rapidly changing environments and a lower availability of natural forest foods, which is problematic to some extent because it can potentially bring them into greater conflict with their human neighbors. So then finally, we looked at male reproductive success in a small chimpanzee community in this region. And the idea with this is that social rank is often correlated with reproductive success. In other words, if you're a higher ranking male, you're likely to sire more offspring than if you're a lower ranking male. This has been found in chimpanzees, in other primate species and other animal species, as well as even in some human populations too. So we examined male reproductive skew in one community in this fragmented forest landscape. And by reproductive skew here, I mean a certain male having a disproportionate share of sirings of offspring. And we looked at this in the Bulindi community of chimpanzees. And these chimpanzees are special in this region for a number of reasons. First, they're fully habituated to researcher presence, so they can be followed closely by researchers, and their behaviors have been closely studied. Individuals are known, and their relationships to each other are fairly well known. And because of this, we know that there was a single alpha male, Sylvester, from the period of 2012 to 2016, about 5 years with those inclusive years. And so Sylvester is the guy that you see here on the left. And we also know that during this entire period, there were between 18 and 22 chimpanzees at any given time present in the community. And that's a pretty small community size. Chimpanzees can have communities of 50 or 60 individuals, or even up to 200 or more individuals. And the fact that it's a small community is an important part of the story here. And there were 5 mature males during that time period, 8 mature females, and there were 8 offspring conceived during those years. So we collected fecal samples for paternity testing to better understand patterns of male reproductive success. And what we found was that Sylvester was very reproductively successful. He sired 7 out of the 8 offspring born during this time period. And even though we know that there is some degree of skew in chimpanzees, this was particularly high. So this exceeds male reproductive skew found in other studies of chimpanzees and closely related bonobos, because it's thought that bonobos may have higher levels of reproductive skew than chimpanzees do. But in our study, despite it being chimpanzees, not bonobos, it was still extraordinarily high. And so here's a figure. It may be a little bit hard to see, but what we have here is the community size and the percentage of offspring sired by the most successful male. So you can see that as community size gets larger, the number of mature males gets higher. And that means that it's really hard for a high-ranking male to really dominate access to a mature female and a reproductively receptive female. And as community size gets smaller, like it is at Bulindi, it may be easier, despite the presence of numerous mature males. Sylvester, it seems, was really able to monopolize those opportunities and keep other males from mating successfully with receptive females. And that's part of, I think, what makes the skew level so high in this small community size. And this is significant for a couple of reasons. First, it really shows that community size and social factors play a really big role in male reproductive success. And it also shows that lots of different things can interact together to potentially decrease genetic diversity and increase inbreeding risk in threatened populations. So in other words, we already know that smaller populations are at bigger risk of having reduced genetic diversity and potentially going extinct due to inbreeding or really decreased genetic diversity that can affect their kind of genetic health as a population. But then, in addition to that, if you have these kind of social factors that come into play, where one male is able to basically almost entirely dominate reproductive opportunities, it can further reduce genetic diversity in a population like this, making them even more vulnerable. So finally, while some evidence suggests bonobos have high reproductive skew, conclusions about species differences between bonobos and chimpanzees may be premature, given the fact that we found such high levels of skew in the chimpanzee population. So some general conclusions. Chimpanzees in a fragmented forest habitat exhibit an abundant and widespread distribution. They show evidence of distinct communities with male phylopatry and female dispersal, much like what we would see in populations living in more continuous forest habitat. They display behavioral flexibility with regard to their diet and their nesting patterns, and they reveal a high degree of male reproductive skew as well. And these conclusions have some conservation implications associated with them. First of all, chimpanzees are remarkably resilient. I think it's really amazing how well they're able to adapt to different kinds of environmental conditions. But of course, there are limits. This population is generally not directly hunted by people, but they can still come into close conflict with their neighbors, and that places a lot of pressure on them. Unprotected forest fragments hold great conservation potential. So when we think about, from a conservation perspective, about what areas get protected, it tends to be national parks and well-protected areas of habitat. But these kind of unprotected forest fragments are places that a lot of species can continue to persist, even when the habitat becomes somewhat degraded. But threats to chimpanzee survival continue to grow, so it's important to also keep that in mind. For example, corridor restoration would be really beneficial to a population like this one, but it must be balanced with the needs of local stakeholders. So we have to remember that there are reasons why there's been so much habitat loss and fragmentation in an area like this, and that has to do largely with growing human populations and the needs of those populations, the needs to use the natural resources as the population grows. And so with that in mind, I want to end by telling you a little bit about the Burundi Chimpanzee and Community Project. I've been an advisory board member on this project for a number of years now, and been really happy to see the work that they've been doing, which I've only had a small role in. The project was established in 2014 by Dr. Matt McLennan, who studies the Burundi chimpanzees, and his late partner, Jackie Rowan. And the project now employs 19 full-time Ugandan staff. They're active in over 180 villages in the home ranges of 7 chimpanzee communities. And they do daily behavioral health monitoring of 4 of these communities. And they have a school fee sponsorship program, which conserves more than 133 acres of forest and supports the children of 32 families. And so when families agree to protect their private areas of forest, in return, their children's school fees are paid for. They've distributed more than 3 million tree seedlings, and those are both natural forest species and cultivated species like coffee, and people are free to freely take those seedlings and plant them on their property. And they've also constructed 26 boreholes and wells as well. And these are places that provide safe access to drinking water. It keeps people from having to go directly into the forest to obtain water, which keeps them out of conflict with the chimpanzees through direct interactions as much. They've also installed more than 900 energy-saving stoves. This reduces the pressure on the natural forest resources because they use up much less firewood than a normal stove would. And they've also started a women's business savings group to support alternative livelihoods. And this is an entirely women-led group that supports livelihoods that reduce the pressure on those forest resources again. And so if you're interested in learning more about this project or in supporting them at all, I really highly recommend going to the website friendsofchimps.org. Friends of Chimps is a nonprofit organization that was established to directly support the care and conservation of chimpanzees. And they support a couple of really great projects in Uganda, one of which is the Burundi Chimpanzee and Community Project. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for your attention. And I want to acknowledge the many people who and organizations that contributed to this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCarthy. That was amazing. It's so interesting. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or pop them in the chat. Dr. Gabriel, go ahead.
Dr. McCarthy, an impressive display of research on a small group, or I guess a large group. I have a question about the female dispersion data. I don't know if it's easy to go back to the slide where you looked at the female pattern where you were linking daughters to mothers, but it looked like some groups had multiple connections. And I'm wondering if you might have a hypothesis about whether mothers and daughters tended, or genetic related females tended to disperse into similar groups.
Let me just get back there quickly. Here we go. So whether genetically similar females tended to disperse to the same groups. That was...
Yeah, I'm kind of looking at that mother-daughter, the purple circles on the right-hand side there. It looks like there's multiple connections. So I'm just curious, do you think, is that one mother with multiple daughters, or I'm just kind of curious?
Yeah, it's a little bit hard to know. So yeah, in some cases, it seems clear that there's a single mother connected to multiple different females. I think it's a bit difficult because there are somewhat limited options in terms of where females might go when they do disperse. And so it may be that they sort of end up in, communities with their sisters, for example, sometimes, just because if they end up somewhere, there's not so many different options, especially given how far apart the communities are from one another. So I think that that's the most likely explanation for some of that, is just, sort of.
You don't necessarily think that's perhaps daughters prefer, or sisters preferring to congregate in similar groups? You think it's more about the fact that there are limited groups for them to disperse into?
I mean, it certainly could be. This is one of the things I think that this issue of female dispersal is so fascinating, because we know so little, even in well-studied communities, about dispersal and about, when females choose to disperse or not, because dispersal, even in more protected areas, is not 100%. Sometimes females will choose to remain in their birth community throughout their life, probably because, the resources are better, or depending on their rank. There's been some research on that, but those decisions for females, I think, are so interesting, and there's so much that we don't know about it. So, I mean, I think it's really fascinating. Like if there is more contact than we think, where individuals are kind of encountering other communities. If they encounter a neighboring community normally in the forest, they might see that a relative is in that neighboring community, and that may motivate them to want to transfer to that community with a female relative present. But also, yeah, I think it's difficult to infer, that we don't know enough about what opportunities a female might have to know that a relative is in one of these, quote unquote neighboring, but not so neighboring communities. So.
Well, thank you very much. Very fascinating data. Beautiful story.
Thank you.
Okay. So if you don't have anything else, I'm gonna pop this survey into the chat. So if you would please just do me the brief favor of filling that out. And then if you do come up with another question, Dr. Radke has her hand raised.
Hi, Maureen. So what's next? maybe there's a ton of things that are next. So
Yeah, so much like a lot of the research that I've been doing in the past few years is kind of a different project that I started as a postdoc in Germany at the Max Planck Institute, and that was looking at uh, chimpanzees and understanding kind of demographic variation in chimpanzees and behavioral variation based on camera trap videos. And so with that project, it was a very large scale project where we have about 40 different field sites throughout Equatorial Africa where researchers went out and collected data. So we have a massive amount of data from populations all across Equatorial Africa now. And we coded about 20,000 chimpanzee videos from all these different locations. And so I've been doing a lot of work analyzing chimpanzee videos, camera trap videos over the last few years, and learning a lot about what works and what doesn't work using camera trap data as a tool for really like monitoring populations and monitoring their variation. And that's also a tool that's been really useful for studying chimpanzees in this kind of fragmented habitat. We've been installing camera traps in the forest fragments as well to try to better understand certain aspects of the population there. And so I kind of want to be able to, apply some of those methods to understanding this population too. So we'll see.
Sounds like an amazing project.
Thank you.
All right. So if no one has anything else, I think that we are good to go. Thank you, Dr. McCarthy, so much for being here and for presenting your really fascinating research. And thank you all for joining us and coming to learn about chimpanzees. And we hope that you have a great night.
Thank you so much.